大家好，我认识 Bill 已经整整20年了，他一直是担任我们华人牧者团契的高级顾问，特别是美中的公共关系领域。因着神的恩典，也因着他住在新墨西哥州，特别是因为他爱中国，所以我们就有一个很长时间的关系。Bill 去过中国10多次，他非常关心中国教会的发展。早在2001年，他就提醒我们，中国教会不能走西方教会没落的路，必须走出自己的路。这个秘诀就是圣经世界观。对于这样的忠告，我们20年前还听不懂，但是20年之后，特别是因着美国的大选所暴露出来的各种令人吃惊的堕落，我们渐渐明白了这个重要性。从2021年2月底开始，也就是下周，我们将在每周的星期四播放我跟比尔的对话，特别是就着美国和西方教会所面临的重要议题来互动和讨论，为的是帮助海外的基督徒和教会思考华人教会的社会使命这样一个话题。我们本周的这2集的访谈是一个铺垫和预备，这个访谈其实是1年前制作的。今天的这一集，我们给大家提示3个看点。第一是比尔的个人背景和他的成长。他出生在芝加哥，家境一般，信主之前他是一个嬉皮士。第2个看点是因为他渴慕真理，就去读了林肯基督教大学。毕业以后，他带着使命和新婚的太太一起开车来到新墨西哥州，因为这里有一个世界著名的国家实验室，就是造原子弹的地方。第3个看点就是他在新墨西哥州做牧师有16年之久，后来参选成为美国的国会议员。他在美国的国会和华盛顿 DC 与尼克松总统前顾问科尔森合作，在美国的16个州草根推动美国基督徒和教会的圣经世界观运动。好，我们就请大家下面来观看第1集的访谈。
I was born in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago. My father was a factory worker, and my mother was a nurse. Grew up in a very small house. Attended a Catholic school for elementary school and a public school for high school. I went to Murray State University in Kentucky, and there I began to read the Bible with a group of Christians, and for the first time in my life, even though I had engaged in religious activity, I really didn't understand that Jesus was Lord over all creation. And it was no longer just doctrines to memorize. It was a deep, profound understanding as to who he is, and that I'm made in his image and likeness, and that that he loves me and he loves you. After attending Bible study there for a couple of years at the campus house in Kentucky, I decided that I wanted to know more. And so I talked to the campus minister. He said, well, there's Bible college. I said, Bible college is where they just study the Bible. And I said, that's where I want to go. So I packed up, and my young bride, we were very young, and early 20s, 21 and 22, and we moved to Lincoln, Illinois. Most of the credits that I had from the university were from political science and accounting. What happened was I completed my undergraduate degree in Christian ministries and preaching. At that time, I was also pastor, small rural church. At a later point, when I graduated, I was a special education teacher for severely, profoundly retarded adults, and I went back to seminary, and there I focused on theology and philosophy. The focus of that was philosophy of science. And that was when my mind really began to open up about biblical worldview and Jesus being Lord over all things. And before Jesus gave the Great Commission, he said, all authority in heaven and earth is mine. Therefore, go make disciples of all nations. He's referring to the entire dominion mandate that we see in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. He is Lord over physics. He is Lord over medicine. He's Lord over education. He's Lord over the stars, the galaxies, DNA, politics. There's no human activity that a human being can engage in that if they confess Jesus as Lord, that he's not the Lord over that. And so it radically changed my perspective of being the parson in the parsonage, the preacher that just preaches, for Sunday morning when we sing Amazing Grace. And that's important, but it's more than that. But I lost my bid for re-election. I remember sitting in the back of the room, and I had just finished losing a race for the United States Senate, and I thought, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do now? There are times during our life there's different callings, and at that particular conference, I was sitting in the back. I knew who Osganis was. I didn't know he was going to be the speaker, and when he spoke to the Chinese pastors there and other Chinese leaders, he said that when the people in China are having a discussion as to what kind of nation the people of China will create anew, he said, none of you are going to be at the table because you're not prepared. And he was referring to understanding biblical worldview and understanding the times and knowing what to do. I sat there and I go, this is it. But that really was the beginning of having a clear call to help the churches in China not make the same mistakes as the churches in the United States. The Western Church began to enter crisis at the end of the 18th century, heavily during the 19th century. By the time the Western Church got into the 20th century, they were very confused theologically. We need to remember that even Hitler, his regime came in the midst of a Christian culture. And you have to sit back and say, well, how did that happen? What was going on there is that there were key philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Hume, there's others, Voltaire, and they began to question the existence of God. And so in the West, there were many churches that said, well, we could hold on to Christianity and the forms and the rituals and the be nice to everybody and love everybody, and we like that part, but we really don't want the Jesus was incarnated because we don't think that God really exists. And I find that to be schizophrenic to pretend that God exists, but not truly being persuaded that he exists. So there were some Europeans that went off in that direction, and it created a vacuum that led to Nazism and fascism in Germany and also in Italy, and then it opened up the door for communism in Russia, which used to be Eastern Orthodox. But what happened is that there were people that rebelled against that, but instead of resolving the question, that they retreated intellectually, and they retreated from taking action inside the culture. Extreme cases, it came down to Jesus in my heart, nothing in my head. And so the Christianity became something that was only a personal feeling, as opposed to Jesus being Lord over all of reality. And so what happened is that it created a crisis in Western civilization, and many of the Chinese churches that when the missionaries came to China from the churches who had turned their back on influencing the culture, that the Chinese Christians believed that they could be faithful to God if they turned their back on the culture. And now that we are looking at, back 150 years, and we've seen the damage that it's done to Western culture, and there are Christian churches here in the United States right now that continue down that path only to their own destruction and the destruction of the culture in which they live. Some churches are beginning to wake up, but for the most part, there's massive amounts of cultural damage, educational system, medicine, law, sociological laws now in place. There's no longer, laws in America is no longer founded on the idea that there's a transcendent God that gives meaning to everything. If all the Chinese church does is imitate the American church, then China, the church in China will never be the light and the salt that God called them to be in their situation only as they know how, because they're Chinese, transforming Chinese culture, that they would inevitably be only a echo or a shadow of the Western church that is under decay and collapse. And my heart went out to the Chinese people and the Chinese church, helping the leaders in the Chinese church to understand that if they follow the American church as it is, in decline, that inevitably they too also will be in decline. Chuck was part of the Richard Nixon administration, and of course, as we all know, the globe knows that Richard Nixon, traveled to China and began strengthening the relationship between the United States and China. So, but Colson was a part of that, and he went to prison. Because of his participation in Watergate. He broke the law, and he should have gone to prison, and he understands that, and he acknowledges that. But prior to going to prison, there was a Christian that was witnessing to him, and he became he fully persuaded that Jesus was Lord before he was convicted and before he went to prison. But while he was in prison, he read a biography about William Wilberforce. And William Wilberforce was the British parliamentarian who ended the slave trade and ended legalized slavery in the British Empire. And so Colson was very excited about William Wilberforce, and he envisioned this whole movement where the Western church could have a renewal of their mind, and they could be grounded in a biblical worldview and be very effective in living out that biblical worldview in multiple ministries that would also be testimonies to the fact that Jesus, the creator, sustainer, redeemer, consummator of the universe. He began to put together the Colson Center for Worldview Studies. The idea of worldview studies could begin to permeate the church. It's our attempt to live out our faith in our day, understanding that Jesus is Lord over every domain of reality. Because we're fully persuaded that Jesus is Lord, anything that denies that in a gracious way, in a loving way, in a winsome way, in a rational way, those ideas need to be challenged. Naturalism needs to be challenged. Modernism needs to be challenged. Postmodernism needs to be challenged. Naturalism says God doesn't exist. And people say, well, that's just a different faith. And some people say, well, that's not even a religion. Well, when in reality, when you look at the scripture, there's no word in the scripture for atheist. A human being is either faithful to the one who created him, or he's an idolater. And in the case of naturalism, the individual ends up becoming the idol, or the society, the collective becomes the idol. So these are all idols, and idols, because they are the projection of man's mind, there's no room for valuing human beings under the naturalistic worldview or the modernist worldview, and definitely not postmodernism, because postmodernism says that there's no such thing as truth. Well, if there's no such thing as truth, that means that there's no basis for right and wrong, what is good, what is evil. And you can't live with that worldview. So it's important for God's people to be grounded in the biblical worldview that says that Jesus is the creator of all reality. He's the sustainer of all reality. He's the redeemer of all reality. And when he comes in glory, he's going to complete it. There will be a consummation of all reality. So there's no part of a human being's life that does not come under the lordship of Jesus. This is part of what we were talking about, that the American church, that they have lost that perspective. It's imperative that we understand the worldview and we make it come alive in the communities in which we live.